Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ANAB's webinar on cybersecurity conformity assessment. I am David Feist. I will be facilitating today's session. Let's cover a few logistics right at the beginning. All attendees to this webinar are muted. There is a Q&A box, question and answer box that you can submit your questions via. With this Q&A box, we will likely save all of the questions to answer at the end of the presentation. We have two co-presenters today who will be addressing this and will also be answering your questions. Warren Merkel is the Vice President of Policy at ANAB, supporting our engagement with government stakeholders. Prior to joining ANAB, he was part of the NIST team that developed the recommended criteria for cybersecurity labeling for the consumer Internet of Things for products in response to Executive Order 14028. Warren was also co-convenor for the most recent revision of ISO IEC 17025. In addition, Keith Mowry is a co-presenter. He is the Senior Manager of Business Development at ANAB. He is ANAB's representative on the ANSI International Conformity Assessment Committee, ICAC, the U.S. National Mirror Committee to ISO-CASCO. He served as the ICAC chair for over 20 years and has over 30 years experience with ISO standards and guides for conformity assessment. Please welcome these two fine gentlemen. I am going to turn the presentation over to Mr. Merkel.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks everyone for joining. I really appreciate the time that you're taking out of your day to look at this. Clearly, there is a lot of attention on cybersecurity, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And in particular, there are recent government initiatives around cybersecurity related to Internet of Things products, particularly for consumers. Our objective today is really to educate any potential stakeholders regarding the conformity assessment aspects related to cybersecurity of IoT products. We'll make it very clear here at the outset, and for those of you that are cybersecurity experts, it'll probably become more clear as we go through this, that neither Keith nor I is a cybersecurity expert. We're really looking at this through the lens of conformity assessment and the related standards, and in particular, how those standards can be used in accreditation of laboratories testing and certification bodies certifying IoT products. Now, many of you may be joining because the FCC released a report and order last month establishing a voluntary IoT labeling program, the Cyber Trust Mark. The content presented in our webinar today is based on the order and other publicly available information. It's really, in many respects, we are looking at the same information that many of you are, and using that as the basis for making connections to the standards that are used for conformity assessment and how that may lead to accreditation. I want to be very clear that the FCC was not involved in developing this webinar. We haven't engaged with them on its content. We are just basing this on the publicly available information as of today, April 25th, 2024. We will be posting a recording of this webinar for future reference, but I wanted to make sure that it was quite clear that we're dealing with the information we have today. And while much of the picture is coming together in terms of how the approach in the FCC program specifically and accreditation related to cybersecurity generally is progressing, new information may become available tomorrow or in the near future that would potentially change the way that we've presented some of this information. So with all of that said, clearly cybersecurity is a national priority in many respects. And looking at conformity assessment broadly around cybersecurity, at risk of vastly oversimplifying it, it's really hard. And so there are multiple efforts at the national level as well as state levels to start looking at the individual types of challenges and issues around cybersecurity. We're going to focus here on a piece of that, which is related to cybersecurity for consumer IoT products. But I wanted to make sure that we're kind of in the right space around different aspects of national policy and strategy. So when we talk about IoT, it was a considerable part of Executive Order 14028, improving the nation's cybersecurity. There were other aspects, many other aspects of that executive order that had great work done at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as well as other federal agencies. And a slice of that had to do with the cybersecurity of consumer IoT products. At a higher level and more recently, a national cybersecurity strategy was released by the White House, followed by an implementation plan. And while that overall strategy and plan don't deal in the specifics of conformity assessment that we'll talk today, they set the broad landscape around our government's recognition that cybersecurity is a significant risk at all levels of our economy and globally. And so when the FCC moved forward with its report and order following previous notices of proposed rulemaking, it's a significant step forward in becoming more specific around how conformity assessment and the related requirements could be developed for consumer IoT products. That effort is not new. There's been a cybersecurity for IoT program at NIST for many years. And of course, the concept of the IoT and work done at NIST and other agencies and private sector organizations predates that by many years. But again, when we focus on IoT cybersecurity more specifically, there's a series of NIST reports, 8259, the 8259 series, the first publication in 2020. There are still active work going on in that series today, and that looks at IoT more generally. The work under the executive order that we completed at NIST resulted in recommended criteria for cybersecurity labeling for consumer IoT products. That was released in February of 2022. And then that fall, NIST took that general information and the approach to labeling that was part of that work and released a profile of a core baseline for consumer IoT products in September 2022. Now, that document's super important because it's mentioned in the FCC's program as the framework where requirements will be built. But if you look at that document, the overall structure and the criteria that are identified there are pretty high level and allow for flexibility to apply those fundamental product capabilities and product developer activities to a range of products. When we're talking consumer IoT products, and we'll get to more specifics in a moment, there's a range of different technologies, a whole vast array of security controls that can be put in place, and a dynamic nature to the cybersecurity threats that in many respects is different than almost any other type of conformity assessment activity. So given that, it's really important then to keep in mind those core capabilities in NIST 8425 and to follow how that framework will be used to identify criteria for labeling products ultimately with the Cyber Trust mark. I won't go through clearly all of the report and order was quite lengthy, but just to make sure that we're level set here, it does provide specific amendments to Part 8 of 47, Title 47 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And there are lots of aspects of that report and order that are relevant to conformity assessment and some that are much more related to the potential administration of the program. So today we're going to focus on a couple aspects of this. One is looking at the fact that the report and order identifies testing by a cybersecurity testing laboratory. If it's a third party, it can be designated as a cyber lab that's accredited to the international standard ISO IEC 17025. So we're going to take a little bit of time to go through 17025 and its implications in this case. An additional requirement is that the products themselves will be subject to review and certification by a cybersecurity label administrator that's accredited to the international standard ISO IEC 17065. And then finally, as I mentioned, the technical criteria are to align with NIST IR 8425. So we have some basic components. The program is evolving. I think from my personal experience in doing the work when I was at NIST, moving beyond the theoretical that we addressed under the executive order when I was at NIST into the practical that FCC is undertaking with this report and order and developing the program is a significant step with tremendous difficulty. So I give a lot of credit to the FCC in getting as much feedback as they could from the community, starting to nail down some of the criteria and move forward. The picture's still coming together, but let's talk a little bit about what we know based on what's in there, and to a certain degree extrapolate to how this could eventually move forward. Before I move on to the specifics of 17025, many of you may be familiar with another FCC program for the designation of telecommunications, the telecommunication equipment authorization program. And that model that's been used for decades by the FCC to facilitate and get products in the market with the FCC designation also is and has been for many years based on use of data from accredited testing laboratories and certification by an organization that's identified as a telecommunications certification body. So in many respects, the FCC is leveraging, and it was clear in the responses in the order, they're leveraging their experience. That program has been tremendously successful in allowing the FCC to continue to address needs in regulating products in a very dynamic market. And so generally speaking, when you think about cybersecurity, there are some very similar aspects. There are also some really distinct differences in the criteria that are assigned to telecom devices, their interoperability, the electromagnetic compatibility in particular, that allows for testing in a pretty traditional sense and certification, again, in a way that has been well tested using the standards ISO IEC 17025 and 17065 and their predecessor documents. We're in a different place with cybersecurity, and so we will be working together with the community as we at ANAB look to support FCC's efforts and apply when the time is right to be recognized as an accreditation body for both 17025 and 17065. So some considerations when we talk about conformity assessment. You have to get down in the details. It's a detail-oriented business. So we'll start just by some of the text out of the order that starts to zero in on what we're looking at. They're talking about consumer IoT products that are within the program, including both the device, the physical device, as well as additional product components that are necessary to use the device beyond its basic operational features. That device itself, to be considered as an IoT device under the definitions of this program, as well as consistent with previous publications from NIST and elsewhere, it needs to be connected to the internet. It has to intentionally emit radio frequency energy. Again, part of where FCC lives is in the telecom network and the way that devices connect to that. It has to have at least one transducer or sensor interacting with the physical world and a network interface of some type interfacing with the digital world. That's still a pretty broad definition between the product itself, which includes the device and all of the other stuff behind it. But that also could include some other types of devices that FCC was quite clear are out of scope at this stage. Those exclusions include, among other things, computing devices, smartphones, medical devices that are regulated by the FDA, and motor vehicles that are also regulated by a different agency. But that still leaves a lot of area to cover when you consider IoT products that are primarily focused on consumer use. Now, we've got the description here. The other thing that's going to be really important as we move forward is making sure we're speaking the same language and terminology. Now, there's a lot of words on this slide, so I'm going to walk through it because this helps us then start figuring out the roles and responsibilities of different players in cybersecurity conformity assessment generally, and in response to the FCC program in particular. We're going to start at the basics. We have whole sessions on conformity assessment and practice, and we're going to try and do it in a digested way. But conformity assessment is just demonstration that specified requirements are fulfilled. We've already talked about some of the requirements that are going to be involved in this program, but the definition of a specified requirement itself is a need or expectation that is stated. There are some high-level requirements and guidance in the NIST 8425. There's a lot of different documents and standards out there related to cybersecurity and that could be used in some way for conformity assessment. But at the end of the day, those requirements have to be specific enough that the conformity assessment process can be completed. The object of conformity assessment is the entity to which specified requirements apply. In this case, that was what was described on the previous slide. So we know basically what that's going to look like, although again, the specificity of those components that support the physical device is still something that could vary from product to product. Now, a couple more things, then I'm going to get into the specifics of 17025. An important definition here for testing helps us frame where 17025 is applied and how it's applied. Testing is defined as a determination of one or more characteristics of that object of conformity assessment according to a procedure. And a procedure is a specified way to carry out an activity or a process. So we won't go into all of the sort of loops of information there, but there are 2 points I want to emphasize here. We need to know what those characteristics are. We need to have a procedure which specifies how we then determine those characteristics. But you follow that procedure now. I test the product today and generate a test report, and that's it. Anything that happens after today would be a different test or a retest or some iteration of that process, that procedure. And so looking at how the nature of consumer IoT products changes, there's a lot of consideration that needs to be put into how and when those testing procedures are developed, what they are, and then how often you do them. I'll end with a couple of other terms here. Certification is a third-party attestation related to that object of conformity assessment, except for accreditation. And accreditation is also third-party related to the conformity assessment body itself. So certification, a couple key things there. Third-party has to be independent of the producer and the consumer of the products. And accreditation is looking at that certification body or testing laboratory in this case to ensure that they are competent, impartial, and operate consistently. So when you start thinking about the criteria that are in the order and thinking about how this fits together, there are a lot of different considerations that apply to the different standards. So 17025 itself, for those of you that are new to this and have never been around the ISO IEC 17000 series standards, the most recent version of 17025 was published in 2017. It's general requirements for the competence of testing and calibration laboratories. When we're talking about cybersecurity, we're going to be squarely in the testing part. It's got 5 normative clauses. The general requirements lay out criteria for impartiality and confidentiality. Structural requirements define how the laboratory, in this case, is organized to ensure that competence, impartiality, and consistent operation. Resource requirements have a number of considerations related to what a laboratory needs to bring to bear to actually test things, in this case, consumer IoT products. Do they have the right personnel, facilities and environmental conditions? Do they have the right equipment to do it? If they're actually measuring physical characteristics or other quantitative numbers or characteristics, do they have the right measurement traceability behind it? And then finally, what external resources do they use? The process requirements largely follow through what you would consider a typical sequence of events when a laboratory is going to perform testing. How do they get the request in the first place? How do they choose the method to apply? If they're going to sample, whether it's within or among various products, how do they do that sampling? How do they handle the items that they're testing to ensure their integrity through the process and beyond? How do they keep their records? If they're doing measurements, how do they evaluate the uncertainty for those measurements? And what do they do to ensure over time that the results that they're presenting to their customers and other stakeholders continue to be valid? And then finally, at the end of the process, they issue a report. One of the benefits of looking at standards like 17025 and 17065 is they also provide a framework around accountability for the organization. So additional process requirements involve how the laboratory handles complaints, what they do when they find that the work was not in conformance with the requirements that are put in place, and then finally, how do they handle their data and information? Between clauses 5, 6, and 7, that's really getting at that competence element of this. Do they have the right people and resources? Do they have good processes in place? And are they implementing that in a way that is providing valid outcomes? Clause 8 around the management system has a number of components to support the consistent operation and ongoing improvement of the laboratory to meet its obligations to its customers and stakeholders. That was really quick. There are a lot of resources out there for learning more about 17025 ANAB. We offer a number of different training courses around that, as do other providers. If you have more interest in that, we will give you some information and links at the end of the presentation. So one last thing, when we talk about cyber labs, which are defined as being third-party impartial, and how that relates to 17025 and the accreditation process that we brought to bear, that impartiality is really important. For third-party organizations, it's a pretty well-established process. Within the report and order, there appears to be the possibility that a certification body that Keith will talk about in a minute could also use an internal lab or another mechanism for testing that is not designated as a cyber lab. So the demonstration of impartiality in that case is going to be really important. Resources are a challenge for any type of laboratory in any environment. But with the dynamic nature of cybersecurity and the threats, finding competent personnel and having the right facilities, equipment, and mechanisms for testing are going to be really challenging. This isn't unique to this program. For the FCC, cybersecurity testing and evaluation generally is quite complicated. Because the testing process requires that procedure, how the test methods are selected, developed, validated, and verified can be really challenging in any case. And when you're talking about looking at the cybersecurity controls and considerations around a given consumer IoT product, there's a need to have a level of specificity to ensure consistency and confidence in the outcomes. That's going to be difficult, as well as ensuring that over time, those results, as those test methods are exercised in the future, are going to continue to be valid. And then finally, we go back to the 8425 criteria. Some of them are pretty straightforward stuff. Some of them are not necessarily related to what you would consider testable generally. So there's going to be some interesting discussions in the development of these criteria around different products on how the test laboratories, the cyber labs or other laboratories would present that information to the certification body, the Cybersecurity Labeling administrator that we're going to talk about in a minute, to then use that information and make their determinations. Hopefully this is helpful in setting the stage around the test lab aspects of this. I'm going to pass the presentation over to my colleague, Keith Mowry, who is going to talk in more detail around the requirements related to ISO IEC 17065. Keith, over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Warren, and hi, everybody. As Warren noted, testing and testing laboratories are going to play a role in this FCC program. And the FCC program also alludes to and refers to ISO IEC 17065. And just to briefly review that, as you can see from the layout of the slide here, it looks a lot like 17025 in terms of its general structure, and that's certainly true. 17065 sets requirements for the competence, consistency, and impartiality of certification bodies, as opposed to testing laboratories. Those requirements are broken down into the categories in clauses 4 through 7, much like Warren described for 17025. And there's also a similarity that in clause 8 in 17065, there are management system requirements that require the certification body itself to take a systematic approach to self-governance or self-control to assure the ongoing fulfillment of the clauses 4 through 7. Those are the requirements in those clauses. Now, one aspect of 17065 that's particularly important is that 17065 as a standard assumes that a certification body that fulfills that standard will always follow a certification scheme or a certification program when it carries out its actual certification activities. 17065 places no restrictions and no limitations on the program or the scheme itself. That's really outside the scope of the 17065 standard. However, 17065 does obligate the certification body to follow that scheme or program whenever it performs its certification activities. So how does this apply in the FCC program? Well, 17065 applies as requirements to bodies that in the FCC report and order are referred to as Cybersecurity Label Administrators, and or CLAs. So good news, we get at least one new acronym from the FCC report and order, so that's always good news. And CLAs really are the focal point for the overall operation of the program from the point of view of the product and service providers that to which the FCC label is going to be applied or is going to be related to. So the CLAs interact with those applicants, those providers, and handle almost the entire process of which the testing that Warren talked about is one part. So CLAs are in effect product certification bodies, and especially from the ISO IEC 17065 point of view. And the FCC program, published in the report and order, is the scheme that 17065 references. So, by fulfilling 17065, the CLAs are obligated to adhere to and carry out the FCC program the way it's laid out. The program itself imposes responsibilities and limitations that go beyond what 17065 references for schemes and programs. So what's the upshot of this?
the result is that whoever performs as a CLA will certainly need to pay equal attention to both the requirements of 17065 and all of the requirements for CLAs and for performing the program in the new 47 CFR Part 8, Subpart B. So if we consider 17065 and the program as it's described in the report and order, what does the certification process for this program, as carried out by a CLA, what does it actually look like? And again, as Warren stated, we are looking at this based on the information we have today. As things change and evolve, this description could change and evolve as well. But as a first impression, as Warren described, the process really starts by the applicant deciding how they would like their product or service tested. The product or service provider can engage a cyber lab that Warren described to do the testing before applying to a CLA, or according to the report and order, the applicant can request that the testing be done by the CLA if the CLA offers such testing. Now, the process really starts with the application to the CLA, and that's made directly to the CLA. The FCC is not involved in the process at this point. There are significant declarations, some of which carry the penalty of perjury, and other information that are a required part of the application to the CLA, in addition to the information and results of the testing that Warren described. Now, an interesting aspect is that the program indicates that the CLA is limited to working only with the applications it receives and the products and services it certifies. So what that implies is that the initial choice of a certification body or a CLA will be pretty important for the applicant, because once you apply and you're in that process, it doesn't appear that you're going to be able to jump to a different CLA unless perhaps you go all the way back to the beginning and restart the process from the start. So with the application submitted, the CLA examines all the testing information, all the testing results, all the submitted declarations and informations for fulfillment of the requirements laid out in the new rules for this cybersecurity labeling program. So after that examination, what happens next? Well, the program itself does not set any specific requirements for the CLA activities that happen after they've done that examination. As a result, the requirements in 17065 alone will apply, and those requirements relate to activities identified as the review and the certification decision. You can find out a lot more about what those activities are by reading the 17065 requirements and reading the definitions of those terms in ISO IEC 17000. Now, the formal grant of authorization to use the label is delivered by the CLA to the applicant. There will be a formal document that the CLA will issue, and that document must refer to the FCC as the authority under which the label is, the authorization for the label is granted. Now, if an applicant doesn't like a decision that the CLA makes, particularly a decision that the authorization is not going to happen, those are the decisions that usually aren't very popular, then the program indicates the applicant will appeal that directly to the CLA first, and if not satisfied, then the FCC would be the final arbiter of that kind of an appeal. Once that authorization to use the FCC label is granted, the program indicates that there are some very specific records and information that the grantee, the provider of the product or service, is required to maintain throughout the life of the product and throughout the life of its authorization. So after the grant is issued, and the FCC Cyber Trust mark is authorized for use, then the CLA carries out post-market surveillance. And again, this would be of the products it has certified. And that's the scope of the post-market surveillance the CLA would carry out. Now, currently, the program provides a relatively general description of post-market surveillance that has to do with retesting a portion of certified products as the primary post-market surveillance activity. In addition to that, the report and order indicates the CLA can obtain samples of product it has certified for its own additional surveillance activities. And finally, the CSA is responsible if the FCC wishes to have surveillance tests performed on a particular product, or that the FCC actually provides to the CLA. So the CLA would take care of getting those kinds of testing done during surveillance. Now, periodically, the CLA will be required to report summaries of its surveillance activities to the FCC, and the FCC will provide a format and a frequency for that kind of reporting. And of course, we all know at this point in the certification process, this is where we get into problems with complaints. So for complaints about labeled products, where the complaint is that someone doesn't believe the labeled product actually meets the requirements, the CLA can receive those. They can be directed to the CLA. However, the CLA then refers those complaints to a different entity and to a different process for handling. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. The key here is that the CLA, according to the current report and order, is a collector and then a referral process. It does not handle the complaint directly. However, if a CLA becomes aware of non-complying product directly through its own surveillance activities, not through a complaint, not through somebody else, but through its own activities, then the CLA is directly involved and does directly handle that. They notify both the FCC and the provider of that product or service of this non-complying product, and they work with the provider of that product or service to review the corrections or corrective actions that that provider indicates they are going to take. And if acceptable, they can, of course, clear that non-compliance and notify the FCC of the corrective action that the CLA has approved. This is not out of the ordinary, but you can see that this establishes a kind of check and balance of the activities of both the providers of labeled products and the CLAs themselves, because it'll be fairly transparent to the FCC how those situations are handled. Now, in the event that a label or a grant to use the label needs to be withdrawn, the current report and order indicates that that will be handled directly by the FCC. So the CLA does not directly withdraw the authorization to use the mark. So that's the certification process from application through the grant to use the label, the ongoing surveillance and appeals and complaints. In addition, there are a few additional miscellaneous aspects to the certification process and to the CLA. Like a number of other schemes, any CLA is required to accept test results from any accredited cyber lab. So this means that the choice of who does the testing really will belong with the applicant. And if they get their testing from a accredited cyber lab, then they will know that that testing will be accepted by the CLA. It doesn't mean that they comply with the requirements. It means that the CLA is obligated to use that testing when they perform their examination. The CLA is also going to be obligated to ensure that all information on certified products is provided to a registry. And the reference to a registry is a little general at this point in the report and order, but we all certainly know what those kinds of things look like. And finally, the CLA is obligated to participate in a consumer education campaign about the FCC label and this new program. So to be a CLA, an organization must be a U.S. legal entity. And it also must be accredited to ISO/IEC 17065 with the FCC Cybersecurity Labeling Program as the scheme referenced in the scope of accreditation. Now, the report and order makes it fairly clear that accreditation comes first. So first the CLA gets 17065 accredited, and then after it receives that accreditation, it subsequently applies directly to the FCC to be approved as a CLA. And that application, of course, includes the evidence of accreditation to 17065, as well as additional information and declarations. So you see the parallel there with the application of the applicant to the CLA, the same kind of mix of information, not the exact same information, but the same kind of mix is used for CLA applications to the FCC. And that's the key here. You become a CLA by getting approved by the FCC. Getting accreditation is a step along that process. Now, in order to get the ball rolling, there are some special provisions for CLAs and accreditation of them when the FCC program first gets up and running. And this is called the initial deployment phase in the report and order. So because accreditation has to come first and then application to the FCC, in the initial deployment phase, a CLA can apply to and be conditionally approved by the FCC if they submit all the application required information, with the exception of completed 17065 accreditation. In just this initial deployment phase, completion of accreditation is not required in order to be approved as a CLA. However, in this initial deployment phase, the applicant CLA must make a commitment to complete 17065 accreditation within 6 months after the adoption of the standards and testing procedures for the FCC program. So the specific standards and testing procedures for the requirements in the NIST report 8425, as Warren indicated, right, they will be in the future identified and developed, then reviewed and adopted by the FCC. Those specific testing standards and testing procedures have not been identified in the report and order as it sits today, but they will be in this initial deployment phase. So in the initial deployment phase, 17065 accreditation of a CLA will likely need to be initiated and to start and to progress concurrently with the development of the standards and test procedures used to evaluate the products and services. So for CLAs applying during this initial deployment phase, the accreditation process must be able to finish. They have to get far enough into the accreditation process to make sure they can finish within 6 months after these standards and test procedures are adopted by the FCC. So there's going to be some flexibility needed in this accreditation process. And there are options that can be available. They're not typical, but they can be available within the requirements of ISO/IEC 17011. 17011 are the requirements that accreditation bodies like ANAB are required to meet by the report and order. Now, there are other aspects of the certification scheme, this FCC program, that will also be developed and adopted during the initial deployment period. In addition to the standards and testing procedures, aspects like how long does a grant last will be decided. In other words, how often does a grant need to be renewed for a given product or service? Specific details of the post-market surveillance activities. There's some general descriptions of those in the report and order, but more specific details will be developed and adopted by the FCC during this initial deployment phase. And the details of the design of the actual FCC label will be decided during this initial deployment phase. So in the initial deployment phase, 17065 accreditation of the CLAs that want to apply right at the beginning will need to be initiated and will need to progress concurrently with the development of all these aspects of the FCC program. The accreditation process itself cannot finish without these details of the program because 17065 references those details as requirements for accreditation. So again, the key message here is there's going to be some flexibility needed for CLAs that want to seek accreditation at the very beginning of the program during the initial deployment phase. And there are possible options that are completely consistent with 17011 requirements. Now, after this initial deployment phase is over, all the details have been adopted by the FCC and everything's up and running, all this kind of, concurrent and complexity, that kind of disappears, right? And a fairly normal 17065 accreditation process will be applicable. That is, you apply for 17065 accreditation. It's the FCC labeling program that you want as the scheme in your scope of accreditation, and it all goes very smoothly. Now, obviously, you would not, by taking that route and waiting, you would not maybe be the first to the market as a CLA, but the accreditation process would be less complex. Now, the FCC report and order indicates that stakeholders are going to come together to develop these additional details that I've been talking about. And the FCC will formally adopt them as part of its rules. But how is that going to happen? Who's going to lead that? Well, this is where the report and order describes what it calls a lead administrator. What the FCC indicates is they will choose one of the CLAs that they have approved to be the lead administrator. And by choose, it'll be an application process. Any CLA that wants to perform the role of lead administrator can apply and be designated by the FCC. The organizations who apply are any of the CLAs that have been approved during this initial deployment phase. So again, apparently there's going to need to be some CLAs that exist first, and then the FCC will go through the process of accepting applications to be the lead administrator. Now, the lead administrator has a number of different responsibilities. In addition to coordinating this development of the specifics of the program during the initial deployment phase, and those obviously would need to be carefully understood and considered by any CLA that was going to apply to be the lead administrator. So, where do we end up? Well, we end up with this new FCC program with some of the details to be determined. That's not really very surprising. That happens all the time when new schemes and programs are established. We've seen that some of the content of the program is acknowledged by the FCC report and order as to be determined. And the report and order lays out a process led by the lead administrator for the development and adoption of that additional detail. Also, as with anything, when you put something into practice, you run into questions and details that have to be straightened out, and that pertains to the portion of the report and order that already lays out the specific processes that are going to be followed. Very typical for any new program or scheme. And the one element that I found particularly interesting is that in comments about the report and order from one of the FCC commissioners, That commissioner advocated expanding the program to include computers, smartphones, routers, and non-consumer IoT products. That might be the biggest to be determined aspect of all. And so there's the FCC Cybersecurity Labeling Program for consumer IoT of products. If you don't walk away with anything else, the message is stay tuned. We look forward to walking down this path with all the stakeholders. We're committed to participating and to providing information to you and updates as they become available. So I'll pass it back to David, and I hope we have some time for some questions. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Keith Mowry and Warren Merkel. Great presentation. Yes, we have had quite a few questions come through, and we'll get to those right after we discuss some additional resources available for accredited laboratories or laboratories seeking accreditation. We have webcasts that are free, pre-recorded videos. We have webinars like today, which are free live informational sessions offered at least monthly. We have the ANAB blog page, which has a wealth of information related to risk, accreditation, standard requirements, and many other topics. And ANAB also offers live, online, in-person, and self-paced training in many areas, and we expect to have training on this subject, cybersecurity and the Internet of Things, coming up shortly. Now, as for questions, as I said, we've had quite a few come in. To start off with, for both Keith and Warren, can international accreditations under ILAC and IAF be accepted for cybersecurity, the Cybersecurity Trust Mark, and for CLAs?
So I'll take this one, Keith, if that's all right. I think the criteria as they're established for accreditation bodies are consistent with the criteria that are used under ILAC and IAF, 17,011 being the basis for it. The only thing that I would say is, at least as it stands today, there would be a process where the accreditation bodies would have to actively apply to FCC to be recognized. So that recognition by the FCC and the criteria certainly are supported by the fact that an accreditation body would be a signatory to ILAC and or IAF, but there would be at least that one additional step related to recognition by the FCC to accredit cyber labs and or CLAs.
Thank you, Warren. Next question. Do you know if the FCC will define added competency requirements for staff required to test or evaluate certain certifications?
Keith, if it's okay,
Sure.
you want to take this one, or do you want me to take this one?
Well, let me start and see what you want to add. Right now, the report and order does not, I do not see an indication there that that kind of detail would be added by the FCC, but of course it always could be. It always could be. And so I think you shouldn't take any one particular answer with and put too much weight on it. I think this is one particular aspect to pay close attention to as the program evolves. Warren, I think you may have more about that.
Yeah, a couple of points I want to add. I think the way that the program is described in the report and order, a lot of the details around the scheme itself will be determined by the CLA, and then those criteria put forward through the lead administrator for the FCC to approve. And so when we talk about establishing those criteria around specific types of products or classes of products, then for higher risk, more complicated products, there may be a need for more for a different level of competency to be defined, and that could be done by the CLA itself. It could be done through the process of approval, or as Keith said, if things come forward, it might be something that the FCC determines is necessary. I think one of the things to emphasize here is the FCC's trying to look at a very broad area. And by incorporating 17065 and the accreditation criteria around that specifically, there needs to be a complete scheme to meet the requirements of the standard. So in the absence of any external standards or criteria that are being developed, then it's the responsibility of the certification body, in this case, the CLA, to establish all of those criteria to have a complete scheme. And so there's a way for this to happen. There's a way for those competencies to be identified. And at the end of the day, if it's the CLA that's taking responsibility for uh, putting forward a product to have the mark on it, then they have a really strong interest in ensuring that the competencies associated with the people both in the laboratory testing and within the CLA are at the right level to ensure the trust and confidence necessary.
Thank you. There are a number of questions that have come in specific to 17065 and 17025. To summarize them, can a lab be approved for 17025 and 17065 from different ABs? And is there a conflict with holding both accreditations?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that first. The short answer is yes, for different ABs. Most markets and most schemes answer the question no. There is not a conflict of being both a 17025 accredited lab and a 17065 accredited certification body. With regard to the FCC report and order, I don't see anything in here that would place any restrictions on a single organization being accredited as a cyber lab by one AB and by being accredited as a CLA to 17065 as by a different AB, as long as those ABs that are involved are both accepted and approved by the FCC. That's going to be the key. Could that change in the future? Well, I suppose so. But my recollection is that's the way that things work in the FCC TCB program, and I believe that it works out just fine. And so one could speculate, just speculation, that would be a premise or a rationale that the same approach could be taken here. Anything to add, Warren?
No, I don't think so. I think there's a lot of, again, and I'm looking at a lot of the other questions, I think as Keith's last slide said, there's a lot of stay tuned kind of stuff here. I do think from the perspective of the standards that are being invoked, there's a lot of different opportunities to have laboratories that are part of organizations that could be CLAs. I think in the TCB program, the mechanisms they have to ensure separation are well established and exercised. So yeah, we'll just see how it shakes out.
Warren and Keith, very specific question here. Can a test report from a non-US based accredited lab be accepted by a CLA under this program?
Yeah, I'll start that one. I did not see anything in the report and order that indicated a cyber lab, the testing entity, had to be a US-based laboratory. Okay, there is a specific requirement that the CLA is an entity in the United States, but a cyber test laboratory, which is different than a CLA, I'm not seeing a requirement there that it has to be a US legal entity. Now, it would have to be accredited by the Cyber Lab accreditation body that's been approved under this FCC program. So there's that. And once a cyber lab is accredited under this program, and the key here is that the cyber lab just needs to be accredited by an approved accreditation body. There is not, for the cyber lab, there's not a subsequent step where you have to then get approval or acceptance by the FCC. That step does not exist for a cyber lab. So once a cyber lab gets accredited by an approved AB under the program, then any test report that cyber lab produces must be taken in as input by any CLA. In other words, the CLA is, the way the report and order reads today, the CLA cannot pick and choose which Cyber Labs test reports it will accept as part of the application.
And I'll just add to that briefly. I know we're at time. There is in the report and order the mechanism for designating those cyber labs. The way I understand it is given to the lead administrator. And so there is that additional step of the lead administrator identifying the cyber labs that are available to the CLAs to use. But again, just to wrap, maybe this could be a wrap up, David, moving into this, there's a lot to be determined around the specific scopes of accreditation for the cyber labs or other laboratories that may be testing, the criteria for the IoT products, and then finally the process and how that will turn into a set of criteria that could be used to identify products that could carry the Cyber Trust mark. It's early days. We wanted to make sure that we at least had some information out there and connect you with other resources around application of 17025 and 17065. And if you have additional questions, I know we didn't get to everything in this Q&A, please feel free to reach out to Keith and or myself directly, and we will help you as best we can.
Fantastic. Keith and Warren, thank you for such a informative presentation. If you feel the need to reach out for additional information on training or accreditation services, please follow the contact information listed below. Thank you for attending the webinar. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.